sorry. I stalled so you would clap longer or really like attention. There's actually some truth to that. Well, good morning. Thank you so much for being here. And this is really a dream come true for me and Janelle. Can we just thank Janelle? She put this whole thing together. Really so proud of her. She's just done a fantastic job just capturing the heart of this house, and she's just one of those very special people that you need to make a difference, right? Like, you know, if what you're doing doesn't need a team, what you're doing isn't God's plan. That's what I believe. If you can do it alone, you're not doing his thing. I just honestly believe that God has a plan for you that's absent of a team. So I think so much of what we do, our success is really in our ability to find the right people and put them around us. And I think so many times we hang around with people like us, and we actually need people who, I don't want to say don't like us, but aren't like us. And that's just such a secret, isn't it? It's just like finding people that are good at what you're not good at. I think sometimes that intimidates us to be around people who are really good at things we're not good at. But if we're gonna raise up world changers, we definitely have to get past our insecurity, right? And we have to realize that there's just nobody's good at everything. So, Father, we thank you for what you're doing today. We thank you, God, that you're raising up eagles' nests all over the world. Places where we can discover, train, equip, and deploy people. Lord, may you give us wisdom today and throughout this week as we interact with these incredible people who have a heart to build a nest for the great ones. Lord, I just bless what you're doing here today, and I pray that you would open up our hearts and our minds. Lord, that what we are doing would be world class, that we would be the best for the world. In Jesus' name. I thought I'd tell you a little bit about our history. So years ago, Bill Johnson and I, most of you probably heard these stories, but I thought I'd just give you a quick 5-minute overview. Bill Johnson and Kathy and I and Benny been together. This is our 39th year together. And so we were very closest friends in Weaverville, California. And we were, obviously it was a very small town with about 3,000 people. And there was about maybe 300 or less people in our church most of the time. And when Bill came to our church, he was a hippie pastor with a flower child wife. We immediately connected. We all got saved in the Jesus movement. So it was very beautiful. They had 2 boys and a girl, and we had 2 girls and a boy, and they were all the same ages. So our kids have dated, but we did not marry into the Johnson family as of yet. But we used to have grandkids now who like each other. So there's still hope. And for about 15 years, we were the closest of friends, and then Bill started traveling more, and Kathy and I owned 9 businesses while we were in Weaverville. But we were the youth pastors for 9 years, and we were home group leader for 17 years. And for about the first 10 years, I was Bill's backup if he couldn't preach for some reason. And so we just became very close. And then Bill and I went to, after Bill came to Bethel, we were separated for a couple of years, and there's a whole long story there. I'm not going to take the time to tell it because I want to make sure that I cover what I feel like the Lord's put in my heart for today. But the short story is we ended up in the airport together in San Francisco on our way home from Colorado, and we had visited my daughter's and son-in-law's base, YWAM base. And Bill said, I'd love for you and Kathy to come and lead this school ministry, which we had been trying to start a school even in Weaverville. Bill had actually had some classes, and so we had talked about having a school ministry for some years. And that short story is I didn't realize at the time for the first 10 minutes that he was talking about leaving our businesses, because at the time we had 4 businesses. But it became very clear as we were talking in the airport that he meant leave everything and follow me, which not too hard for me, but Kathy she's not so faithful. I mean that in a joking way, of course. She actually likes to have facts and figures, just so not spiritual. I came home and with that good news that God had called us to leave everything and follow Bill. And anyways, through a conversation that included tears, she said, I'll do anything that you want to do, providing God talks to me too. So 2 weeks later at Morning Star, Rick Joyner's Morning Star, the Lord spoke to her, and she ended up on the floor, and it was really powerful. And then came home and said, this is what we're supposed to do. So we sold our businesses and ended up at Bethel. We didn't get paid for the first year. We started, and we thought it was going to be fine because we sold our businesses, but the public corporation that bought us after we were here about, I think 2 or 3 months, went bankrupt. And anyway, was not very fun. We went from thinking we were going to have $250,000 to live on to owing $1.8 million. So when we started the school of ministry, we actually owed $1.8 million. And then we went to see the elders. Again, this is all a really long story. Like every one of these is a message. I'm just trying to give you an overview, kind of like where we were and how the school started and what it looked like and why we did it. And then some things that we've seen that are being successful. And I want to share with you our failures too, so that you get a good idea of like what not to do. We could write a book, What Not to Do. In fact, I'll pause for a second and say this. The reason why we have this school is because, we started doing curriculum about, probably 5 years into school ministry. I had a real vision to reproduce what we're doing all over the earth, because we kept having people say, how do you do this? And what do you teach? And I'm like, we need to develop curriculum. So it was not less out of vision and more out of people just pulling on us. And then we developed curriculum. Then people would ask, when we'd have, I'd get emails, 5 of them a day, like, and what would you do if the student did this? And how would you do that? And how would you be? And I'm like, huh. So then Amy Jackson was our first school overseer. So we started a whole department of school overseeing. And then pretty soon she had a couple of interns with her, and they were getting swamped with calls, so they couldn't keep up with it. And I'm like, I think we need to just do a school once a year for everyone who's doing a school. Bring in our teams. Like we're not bringing in necessarily our, the most famous speakers. We're bringing in people who are actually doing school. So you can ask questions. You can hear like every part of school. So what we did, and Janelle's done a beautiful job of this. She put this together. What we talk through is who's actually running our school, who can answer the hard questions, and so you'll be hearing from them all week long. So anyway, we got here. We owed $1.8 million, and Bethel had no money. Bethel was in financial trouble too. Maybe that's encouraging for some of you. You're like, we have no money. Like, yeah, don't even cry over that. And so we went to see the elders because we were going to quit 4 months into being here because we owed so much money, and we owed 127 suppliers. And like I said, we met with the elders, and I got done telling them the whole story, which was about 35, 40 minutes long, our whole journey and how we got here and what happened, the mistakes we made, and that we'd have to go bankrupt because we owe so much money, we'd spend our whole life paying it off. And one of the elders stood up, who'd been here for 40 years at the time, and he said, when we're a family, and when families are in trouble, they don't leave. And so we don't want you to leave. And secondly, we want you to pray. We want to pray for you, and we want to ask that you don't go bankrupt for 6 months. And I said, I have no faith. He said, would you trust mine? So it was a pretty intense moment. Again, lots of tears, very difficult situation. So the elders gathered around us and prayed for us. And really cool thing happened. The timelines are probably bad. This all happened within 12 months. So I think about 3 months later, we got forgiven half our debt, $927,000. 2 months later, we got forgiven another almost $300,000. And so within the next 3 years, all of our debt was either paid off or forgiven. So that's a good word right there for y'all. We spent 9 months developing the school. So before we started the school ministry, we were here for 9 months planning. There was about 5 of us on the planning team. And Bill gave us some core values. Bill was not a visionary, contrary to some popular opinion. Bill is a real purpose, presence-driven guy. And so I would go into, when I came the first week I was here, I sat with Bill and I said, what exactly do you want the school to look like? And instead of telling me what it looked like, he told me what he wanted to see happen. And so one of our main core values was that we were to do and teach. 1 John says that all that Jesus began to do and teach. And so Bill said, I want us to only teach things that we can do. Which that became the foundation for our 9 months of building. Okay, how do we demonstrate what we're articulating? So now, what we found is you can demonstrate about half of what you're articulating, but there's also theology and those kind of things that are really important to what we're doing, laying a foundation for what we're doing. In other words, a lot of what we're doing comes out of what we believe. And so some of those things are hard to demonstrate. But we began every session with the 5 of us dreaming on a whiteboard, okay, what is it we want to teach? How can we have an activation for that? And that was kind of our starting point. And it was it's kind of funny. It was 7 months into the school when I got the idea to add the word supernatural to our school. So there was no such thing that we'd ever heard of as a supernatural school. So I went in Bill's office one morning and I said, hey, I got this idea. Instead of calling it Bethel School of Ministry, how about if we call it Bethel School of Supernatural Ministry? I'll never forget Bill's expression. He's like, well, that'll distinguish us. I said, what do you think about that? He said, I need to think about that. And it was a few days later, he said, yeah, I think that would be good. And of course, what it did right away is it distinguished us as the crazies. Those are the crazies over there. And so a lot of people would just, call us and say, what does it mean, supernatural school of ministry? And so, we had lots of different answers. In the early days, what supernatural school looked like. But so that was very fun. And of course, now everybody calls their schools such and such supernatural something, Angels School of Supernatural Ministry. But that was, that as far as we knew, no one had ever called their school of supernatural ministry. And so it's kind of a funny story in that so Kathy and I, we had no money at all. Like we were living in a little apartment. By the way, we lost our house in the middle of it. We didn't bankrupt, but we gave everything we could back to people. And so we lost our house. We lost everything but our 2 cars and our furniture. So that was pretty discouraging. The house that our kids grew up in that we actually built ourselves, we lost that house. And we ended up living in a little apartment. And I was, fighting off, as you can probably imagine, you build a business for 20 years and basically someone steals it from you, Wasn't very exciting. And at the same time that we're going through that, we're trying to build a school ministry. So, and then Bethel can't pay us, which was our agreement. And Bill said, when you start the school, you can take whatever there is from the school of ministry as far as the tuitions, and you guys can get a paycheck. So we needed 32 students to take $1,000 each, which we figured we could live on $2,000 a month. And the day before school started, we had 18 students after working 9 months for free. So it was very discouraging. And the day we started, we had 37 students. And that year, we graduated 36 of our 37 students, which is pretty miraculous, really. The Lord was really on what we were doing. That's such an understatement. But, we were trying to lay out, we didn't have a curriculum. So what we had is teaching. And Bill, obviously, Bill's a very spontaneous teacher. So if you ever watch Bill, he doesn't have notes. I mean, he doesn't, if you lean over and ask Bill what he's teaching 10 minutes before he's in the podium, I'd say 90%, 80% of the time, he has no idea. So, it was very interesting, developing a school with this, the senior person at the time doesn't know what he's going to teach when he gets in there. So not only do we not have curriculum, we had no idea what he was going to do. So we're like, okay, this is going to be good. And of course, he's always a fantastic teacher, so you can always trust that it's going to be amazing, even though you have no idea which direction he's going. We had some really cool things happen. So remember, we're trying to do and teach, right? So we're in this, at the time, we're in what's the hospitality suite at the church now. It's probably about maybe from that pull over in size. And there's 37 students at round tables exactly like this. And it's kind of longer and narrower. So I'm in there and I'm waiting the first thing that happened is I'm teaching on the voice of the Lord. It's actually what turns into our prophetic training. It's before we actually had prophetic training, really. And I was talking about how God speaks through creation. And so I started reading this verse. It's Psalms 29. I'll read it to you real quickly. Ascribe to the Lord, O sons of the mighty. Ascribe to the Lord glory and strength. Ascribe to the Lord glory to his name. Worship the Lord in holy array. The voice of the Lord is upon the waters. The glory of the Lord thunders. When I said the glory of the Lord thunders, it wasn't raining. And all of a sudden, it just started thundering and lightning. At that verse. It thundered so long, we all laid on the floor because we were upstairs at the time that wasn't insulated. And the lightning and thunder were like so loud, you couldn't hear. So we were all laying on the floor waiting for 40 minutes for the thunder to finish. And when the thunder finished, I finished reading Psalms 29. And that was the very first teaching I'd ever done. So that was pretty cool. I'm like, showing off here today, aren't you? And so I could tell you lots of stuff that happened then. It was really powerful. Things would happen. And I think it was like about a month into school, I was going to do this whole teaching on deliverance. And so I'm sitting in the back of the class preparing, just, going over my notes and, and while I'm preparing, they have some of the students coming up and sharing testimonies. And so, you know how you're kind of like halfway listening, but you're concentrating on, I was like going over my notes, making sure. It's the first time I ever taught it there, so I was just kind of getting everything organized, making sure I had it all down. And while I'm sitting at the back of the table, and the different ones are in line to share testimonies, maybe there's like 3 or 4 testimonies, and then like the 5th one, this girl comes up, and instead of sharing a testimony, she says, I think there's a demon in me. And I'm like, you're waiting for the testimony, right? So about 2 minutes into it, I'm like, this doesn't sound like a testimony. So I put my pen down and I'm listening. And she's like, there's a demon in me and it makes me do things. And she's going on and on about being, I think she used the word even demon possessed. And one of my students is demon possessed. Crap. Hope she pays her bill, Maybe if she's multiple personality, they can all tithe. I actually wasn't thinking anything like that. I was listening to her, and so something just came over me. I'm sure that you probably had this experience before, and nothing I planned. It wasn't even 30 seconds before premeditated. I stood up, and I said, and the Lord frees you. And when I said that, she's a very big lady, and she just fell on the ground, and things started screaming out of her. Now, I was going to teach on deliverance. This is class 1 on deliverance. So I told the students, I said, let's gather around. I'll show you how to do a deliverance. So we gathered around her. She was like on the floor. We just gathered around her, and I started, just talking through basically my notes. Like, this is how you get somebody free. And, and I have done hundreds of deliverances, so it was no anxiety for me. I've done this many times, so I never actually taught anybody to do it like this. So I'm talking them through, and while I'm talking them through, showing them I'm showing them, and I'm telling them why I'm doing what I'm doing, 3 more people fall on the ground, full-on grand mal seizure-like manifestations of demons. And one of them's my staff. I'm like, oh, great. So I broke the whole class up into groups of whatever that would have been, groups of what would have been, like 8 or something. And I said, okay, 8 of you go there, 8 of you stay with me, 8 there, 8 there, there. And okay, you're the leader of that group, you're the leader of that group. Then none of them had ever even, I don't think most of them had even seen a deliverance, even seen somebody manifest, much less do a deliverance. And they were like, are the demons gonna jump on me? The sons of Sceva, like, they were like so afraid they were gonna get, I'm like, oh, it's all good, and so I said to the other group leaders, I said, just do what I do and say what I say. And they're like, all right, so here's these people, now what was that would be like, there was 4 of them, there was 4 of them on the floor just like, and so we took the next 2 hours and we got all of them delivered, which is great. And then, it's good, because that 100% isn't really my, I don't usually shoot that well, but it was just the grace of God, right? And the next day, 3 of them, two or three of them of the 4 testified about how God had freed them and how they'd had this all their life. And the girl that originally fell down, she became our children's pastor 2 years later. That's kind of cool. And so, we, one thing I just like to just, bring to this meeting is we want to, the school's got to be as much about impartation as it is about articulation. And there has to be demonstration. I'm not trying to just make it rhyme. It's just those words work well in memory. We have to be thinking how do we actually demonstrate that there's got to be, I want to say the word, I don't know if it should be pressure or expectation, but there should be both of those on the leadership team to not just stand up there and day after day talk. We're not just trying to stand up there and day after day talk. Now, as our school's gotten larger, and I think we're 2,400 students now, obviously it's much harder. The demonstration part has gotten much harder, especially in the large meetings. And so for us, most of the demonstration, we do a demonstration with prophetic ministry. Deliverance is a little bit hard to do in that big of a group, although we did it this year. People fall down while I'm speaking, and we just take care of it right there. But, the revival groups have become more of the demonstration part. We have all of our whole, you'll hear lots more about this. I don't want to get into someone else's territory, but we broke our school up into groups of about 50 to 60. Some of them are have been as large as 70, but smaller groups where they take and their goal is to take what we're teaching and actually break it down into small pieces and make sure that people, first of all, understand it, so they do lots of questions and answers, but they also are under the direction and commission to actually make sure that what we're teaching happens in groups, that they experience the presence of God, the power of God, the beauty of God, the glory of God, and that things are actually happening in those groups. And so that's you probably, most of you won't have a school, at least initially, that's large enough where you need to break your school into, you can break your school into smaller groups, but not probably groups of 50. So most of your schools you can demonstrate in the room while you're teaching. And so I really want to exhort you that if you want a great school, anyone can get online. In fact, we're going to have an online platform that I think is going to be really good. It's also going to help drive people to your schools. Because, you can't have a virtual relationship with God with virtual leaders and virtual experience. So, but in the information age, there are so many supernatural schools. And to tell you the truth, and Janelle will probably tell you this, people are like, have you ever thought about having an online school? I mean, come on, man, I'm not that stupid. I mean, from the second year, we started Bethel TV. I started Bethel Media, which we used to be called Sound Wisdom. So yes, we wanted to have an online. Yes, we understood about having an online school. Start over. Yes, we had the idea of starting online school before there was online schools. Before they were big. There was just a few business people using them. And people would come up to us all the time and say, you need to start an online school. You could touch the world. But I was so concerned, and so was Bill, about the fact that people were going to learn things they never did. And we're going to have a whole generation of people who think they believe in the supernatural because they can repeat it. And so, for 15 years, 16 years, I have been the one person in our environment, and Bill too, but saying, we're not going to start an online school. That's we're going to end up with a bunch of people that have a bunch of head knowledge again, and the supernatural will be something you believe and nothing you've ever experienced. So I never wanted that kind of school, and to this day, to tell you the truth, I still don't. It's still not a great passion of mine. But the truth is that now there's got to be 50 online schools, supernatural schools. Everybody's got supernatural everything. And a lot of what they're teaching, in my opinion, is just not good. And so I'm like, all right, well, we can let them do supernatural schools and teach our students that they're sinners, saved by grace, and that, that all kinds of weird stuff. And when you add the supernatural word to most things, it gets really mystical and weird. And I'm like, we're going to have a generation of people who actually believe in heresy if we don't actually get involved. And so, and by the way, there are lots of good online schools, so I want to be clear. But there are lots of them that are not. And so over the last couple years, I've just began to have, I feel like a conviction from the Lord that we should enter into that world. We've been doing some of that with some curriculum. It's been really wonderful. And people are giving us really good feedback. So I'm like, oh, maybe we just should do it online with the school. But I want to do two things. One is I want to drive the students to your schools and to ours. So I want to, and Janelle and I have had many long conversations about, I don't want the schools to take the place of what you're doing. I want it to be like a big advertisement, like if you actually want to experience this, you should go to a school in your area. So, because I really do believe that people, you need a relationship. They need relationships. They need moms and dads in their life. I am the king of, I don't believe in independence. I only believe in interdependence. I don't think you can find your destiny without finding your people. So, everything not everything, lots of what I teach is like, you've got to find people. You can't just like hold up in your house and it's me and my three, that's just not the Lord. So anyway, all that to kind of give you an idea where we're going as far as the online platform. We are going to have an online platform. It's going to be excellent. And there'll be activations, asked for on the line, but you actually need people to follow. So I want to just move ahead a little bit and talk about our journey. So the first year, our school was, for what we knew and where we're going, and who the students that we had, basically, if you were warm, you were in our school. And I got to tell you, that wasn't always because of great motives. Kris wanted to eat. So we ended up with some wonderful people, but we also had some broken people, as you hear in my demonstration of deliverance. And and the first year, the second year, most of the people who came to our school, they were out of our church. So they knew us. They had followed us for, at least a little bit of time. And something happened in the third year, and we were growing like crazy. So the first year we had 37 students. The second year we had 62 students. The third year we had 127 students. And our goal, like Bill and I talked about, someday we'll have a school of 300. So, we're dreaming big. And, and we were just started growing exponentially. And then the fourth year, Bill's book came out, How Heaven Invades Earth. And our applications doubled. And we were growing, and it was exciting, but there was something happening. In the fourth year, we graduated students. And I don't know how to say this because it wasn't in my head. There was nothing wrong. Like the students, we always have the students, every year we have them fill out a survey and ask them, to rate the impact the school had on them on every area, because we always want to get better. And the ratings were always good. The students had a great experience. It wasn't like there was complaints, but something didn't feel right in me. I felt something was wrong. And I'll tell you, one of our core values is that every summer we tear the school completely down. So instead of, because I feel like God's always doing a new thing, not necessarily the next thing. So the only way you're going to get the new thing is to make sure that you're not doing the thing you're comfortable with. So every year we tear down the school and we start over, and obviously we end up with 95% of what we did the year before, but at least we knew this is still the current word. Because it's not what God said, but what God's saying. Jesus said, man can't live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds, not preceded, but proceeds from the mouth of God. So we want to make sure that we have current revelation, that we don't get old. And obviously some of our videos are old, and we'll be taking care of that real soon. But we want to make sure that what we're doing is cutting edge, that we're moving with the Spirit, and we're not settling in land that, that's old manna. That's worm-eaten old manna. We want to have current revelation. On top of, obviously, core great doctrine that is generations old. And so the fourth year, during the summer, we were doing what we always do, but I was really grieving, and I felt the grieving was from the Lord, but I couldn't put my finger on it. And one day I had this just an interaction with the Lord, and again, most of the students who were with us by the fourth year were not people who had ever followed us before. And we were emphasizing the do's of Jesus, the signs, the wonders, the miracles. And it was great. And so prophecy, deliverance, healing, all of that kind of stuff we were doing. We were spending lots of time on that. But I started recognizing in the fourth year, with this one encounter I had with the Lord, I felt like we taught people how to do things, but they didn't know who they were. The difference between the first 2 years and some of the third year is that those people were with us a long time, so they knew they were daughters and sons of God. But the people we were training in the fourth year, we didn't do much stuff on identity, and now we're training slaves, paupers, and sinners to act powerfully. And I began to realize, I'm like, wait a second, these people are behaving out of duty and not identity. So that year, everything I did, I tore down and started over. As you'll remember, I said the first month of school, in the first year, I was teaching deliverance. I was teaching prophecy the first day of school. And it's like, okay, and I don't have any problem with that except for if people don't know who they are, then signs and wonders become another law unto themselves, another duty, another way to measure my performance with God. And so I started all over, and it was this same year I was writing The Supernatural Ways of Royalty, and I was going through this stuff in my own life, which I felt was really probably permanent for the school, important for the school. And so I started and I was going through this whole transformation in my own heart, in which that was the year that the Lord told me. In fact, I'll tell you this little story. Is the year the Lord told me, I was laying on the floor and the Lord said, "You're no longer a sinner, but you're a saint." And I'm like, oh, it's not like I'd never heard that phrase before, but when the Lord told me that, it was like, stop teaching Christians that they're sinners. I went into Bill's office and I said, hey, I have this revelation. I want to just run it by you. And he said, what is it? I said, I believe that if we teach people that they're sinners, that they're actually going to be prone to sin. And I just have this idea that when we receive Jesus Christ, that we got transformed from sinners to saints. And of course, Bill always taught on identity, but never actually took it that far, like you're not a sinner. And I said, I think that we were sinners saved by grace, but I don't believe we're sinners anymore. And I remember this is the transition we were going through, and I'm sure Bill was going through it too, in the sense of the teaching. And he said, wow, I need to think about that. He didn't say, oh, that's not good. But he also said, like, it was a new idea for us that we are, and we would teach, we are saints, and we'd also teach you're sinners, kind of like the normal mixture of, depending on the message you were preaching, right? So I'm not saying we never taught people they were saints. I'm saying we never taught people you're not a sinner. And so I was going through this season where the Lord was teaching me about loving me, about me loving me. And I was learning, like, you can't, Jesus said, love your neighbor as you love yourself. So the foundation for loving anyone else is loving you. And I was going through this journey where the Lord was showing me, you've probably heard my messages, because this is the most repeated message I've ever taught. And I was learning that you'll never let someone love you more than you love yourself. And that if someone loves you more than you love you, that you'll build a culture around you that sabotages the people who try to love you more than you love you. And I was learning all this stuff, and I was learning it for me. And I was like, and then I began to see, and I know how this happens for all of us, right? When the Lord shows you something, suddenly you see it on everybody. And I began to see that our school was a bunch of slaves and paupers trying to do powerful stuff. One of the things that awakened me to the idea with the students is that when as the students were leaving our school, especially the 3rd and 4th year students, they were not having success out of school. And we were getting a lot of feedback. Of course, in those days, we were much smaller, so I was interacting with a lot of our graduates, and they were having, not that they were having a hard time, not that none of them have a hard time now, but I mean, the amount of students that did well in school and did terrible outside of school was alarming. And that's why, and that kind of started me on this journey of thinking like, well, what was different from the 1st and 2nd year? And now the 3rd year students and 4th year students seem to really be struggling. And I began to realize like, oh, it's the same, they're having the same crisis I'm having. They don't actually like themselves. And I was raised in a culture, I'm talking about pre-Bill Johnson, I was raised in a house where my parents, my mother loved me, but my 2 stepfathers didn't like me. That's a story been repeated so many times. But then I got saved into the Jesus movement, which also had a really weird kind of mixture of teaching. Actually, the teaching in the Jesus movement wasn't very good. The demonstrations were awesome. The presence of the Lord was awesome, but our theology was sucked. It was, in my opinion, it was horrible. We have a really bad eschatology idea of the last days, which totally, I think, if you will, it sort of castrated all of us. We couldn't move into society and disciple nations because our eschatology was completely against that. We were like, be separate, come out and be separate sort of mentality. But then we totally exalted not feeling good about yourself. So feeling good about yourself was like feeling good about yourself was arrogance and pride. And we talked about people who did that. And so, if you were going to say something good about yourself, you always had to say something bad first. Really, I'm being real. Like, you had to kind of like, I prayed for someone and they got well. Now I know I'm a sinner, and I know it was all Jesus. Those were the kind of statements. Like, you couldn't say, hey, I prayed for this guy and he got well. Like, you just could not say that because it looks like, well, you're bragging. And like as if, you had some power to heal them without Jesus or something. And there was lots of statements around, we want to make sure we don't steal the glory of God. That was a much repeated statement in all of the culture I was raised in before Bill. And I would say this even in the early days of being with Bill, that the idea that you couldn't feel really good about yourself, like you'd feel okay, but you didn't want to feel really good about yourself because the devil fell through arrogance and pride, right? So you're always like, you could just squeak out a little like, this little lot of mine, it's mine. But then you just have to say something bad about yourself after that, And so I feel like I lay the foundation for our school. Bill comes in on a foundation and he just builds whatever he's going to build, and he's got some common themes, and you know the themes because he teaches them on Sunday: the presence of God, the power of God, the purity of God, all of those things he teaches. But I felt like it was in me to kind of like lay the foundation that all of us, the rest of our leaders, would build on. And so I took I one day sat down and I just laid out for myself, okay, I'm going to teach people about who are you? So I spent up to 3 months teaching them, you're a child of the King. Now, I got to tell you that they all think they're the child of the King when they walk in the door. They think they know that. And I guarantee you, out of 1,100 students or 1,200 students that are in first year this year, I would say 1,150 of them would say, I know who I am. And I guarantee you, by the third month, they would say they didn't know who they are. And I would say one of the most powerful things that happens in our school is not the miracles, it's the identity. And I have developed several messages, and so have our team, by the way. We all get involved now, of teaching our students, you're actually a child of the King. Like God is actually your daddy. In fact, he wants you to pray, Abba, Daddy. And I have figured out about 400 ways to say that. I go, look at it this way, look at it over here, look at it this way, look at it this way. And I can tell you when our students get it. It's usually between the second and third month. And sometimes it's like, have you ever seen a wave, like football? How they do the wave around the stadium? I have oftentimes watched the revelation, and I said revelation, spread like a wave as people break into tears. Some of them just begin to laugh. Their eyes open, they ask different questions when they get it. And it goes something like this, exaggerating to make a point. You mean I'm a child of God? You mean, Kris, I got a question. You mean God is my daddy? Yes. Excuse me. You mean like I'm his daughter? Yes. Like, no, I mean, I understand you said yes, but and we begin this process of the revelation is so huge, I actually can't fathom what just happened to me. I actually am having a struggle capturing the real essence of the revelation because it's too big. And suddenly things start to fall off me. I didn't even know were on me. And I watch it spread through the students. This happens every year. That sometimes I'll teach for a couple weeks and a couple will get it. But it usually takes a couple of months. Just, this is who you are. This is how much God loves you. You can't steal God's glory. John 17, Jesus prayed, God, the glory you've given me, give to them. Listen, when you emanate the glory of God, you're being a son or a daughter. Like when you look at Jesus, you're looking in a mirror. God was the painter, the artist. Jesus was the model. You're the painting. And I've developed so many different ways to say, if you believe you're a sinner, you'll sin by faith. If the devil can convince you that your do is your be, he doesn't have to bother you anymore. Condemnation means you lied, you're a liar. But conviction says you're way too awesome to be acting like that. Conviction says you're acting below your identity. And we just begin to I can just tell you I have these are all in my brain. I just do this for months. I tell stories, we read Bible stories, we bring people up to share testimonies, and I'm not leaving this subject until they get this is who I am. I can tell you everything in the room shifts when they get it. Everything changes. The questions change. The confidence changes. Sin habits begin to fall off of people. I'm not saying we don't have problems after that. I don't want to make any exaggeration. But I can tell you that when you realize that your bad doing, it has nothing to do with who you are. Things happen. The prodigal son story in the Greek goes like this. And when he came to himself, he went home. And so we just began to give people permission. Actually, I think the most powerful thing, or one of the most powerful things that happens, is we give people permission to actually feel good about themselves. It's like we create a culture of the goal is greatness. Whoever wants to be great among you must be the servant of all. The goal is still to be great. Like how to get there? Your seat of servanthood becomes your throne of destiny. But the point, Jesus didn't say, don't be great. He said, here's the way to get there. I mean, think about it. 12 guys are hanging around with Jesus. What are they all arguing about? All arguing about. Who's the greatest? Do you think about that? They're all arguing about who's the greatest. And Jesus teaches them humility. He doesn't teach them that's the wrong goal. I love that Jesus has a problem. The problem he has with his disciples is they're all dealing with competing with one another. And you would think that Jesus would work it out in his culture. Like, for instance, when he goes to the Mount Transfiguration, he takes Peter, James, and John. But the crazy thing is, when he raises the dead girl, he only brings Peter, James, and John. And it says, and he made the others stay outside. And what I'm getting at is he leaves the same 9 people outside when he knows they're competing. In our life, if we had kids who were competing, we were like, let's make it fair. See, Jesus created a culture of greatness. He didn't reduce the culture so people would stop competing like we do. We're all equal. No, I'm sorry, you haven't come to a round table. You've come to a rectangular table. There are levels of honor. If you come in and you take the seat and someone more distinguished than you comes in, how many know there are people who are more distinguished than you? And so the point is that you were born to be great. So I do that until, sometimes I just do it for 2 months. Sometimes I do it for 3. It's like I'm not stuck on a calendar. I just do it until we see it. And the next question that comes naturally to people who've got a revelation that God is their daddy is, then how do I behave? I call it, in the book, I call it the attributes of royalty. And I start teaching them, listen, this is how noble people behave. This is how royalty behaves. See, you are a royal priesthood. This is how to behave in the palace. You know, metaphorically speaking, we don't jump up on the couch. We don't put our feet up on the table. This is how we talk. This is how we carry ourselves, because we are not common men. We are noble people. And by the way, the whole world is noble people. They just don't know it. So we're not a part of an exclusive group. We are a part of an exclusive group. The exclusive group is called human, because angels serve humans. And so we began to talk about the attributes of royalty, like how do you actually behave? Now, here's what's important for you as far as leaders of your school. See, whatever you misdiagnose, you'll mistreat. So if you don't make the transition that the people in your school are not sinners, but they are saints, then you will control your students. See, if you believe that they're prone to sin, what do you do with people who are prone to sin? I can tell you that most shepherds who haven't received the revelation that we're actually leading saints. Paul said, while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. And the connotation is, when we didn't deserve it, he died for us. The connotation is, we do now. And what I'm getting at is that if we misdiagnose our people, because how many understand how you lead is determined by who you're leading and who's leading. So if you don't realize that the people you're leading are saints, they are prone to righteousness. In fact, Jesus said that they are the righteousness of God in Christ Jesus. Paul said it throughout the scriptures, that they are actually the righteousness of God in Christ Jesus. In other words, the way I see our people determines how I'm going to lead them. We have to be careful, because we're in the trenches with these people a lot. I mean, there's not a lot of deeper, intimate relationships than actually leading a class every day, when you're involved every day in their stuff. And you know that the people that get the most attention are the people that do something wrong and people who do something extraordinarily right. Everybody else, and if you get people that do a lot of things wrong, it can really take the edge off of who you're leading. I just really want to warn you, especially most of you probably aren't going to have big staffs. So, I am pretty isolated from my students in the sense that I don't do any of the discipline anymore. I'm not involved in any counseling. My students aren't allowed to come and ask for a counseling appointment with me. I mean, you can imagine I wouldn't have time to breathe if I did that. But I remember when I did. And what I'm getting at is most of you are in the trenches with your students. And so you can know them after the flesh and not know them after the spirit. Really easily, if you don't use the gift of distinguishing of spirits. And by the way, the gift of distinguishing of spirits is the most important part of distinguishing of spirits isn't distinguishing evil spirits. It's distinguishing human spirits so that you know your students after the spirit and not after the flesh. I would really encourage you, when you're having a problem with a student, that you step back with some of your team and say, who is this person? And you begin to remind yourself before you step into another meeting with them, who is it that you're actually leading? Because some of the most powerful people in the Bible had really poor character at some point in their life. I mean, Peter, Judas denied Christ, and Peter denied Christ 3 times, and one hung himself and the other became the head of the church. So, we have to teach our students how to fail successfully. A lot of our students are like Peter. They just keep screwing up and screwing up and screwing up. And if we're not careful, we think they're a screw up. There's a big difference between leading someone who messes up and leading someone who is a screw up. It's really important that we don't put that identity on people. And by the way, this is a good time to say this, like, do not name people after some bad character in the Bible. Don't even allude to, well, they have a Jezebel spirit. That's an Absalom. Don't let that come out of your mouth. I'm telling you, I've done it. So, it's like as soon as you name them the name of an enemy, you are not redemptively dealing with them. And by the way, as soon as you think they're an enemy, you need to get a break and let someone else deal with them. Because you're not calling them up to their identity, you're pulling them down into their behavior. And that's their problem. How many know if you believe you're a liar, you're gonna lie? I'll say this, I love AA. I think AA has done such a great, they've really helped a lot of families. I wish my first stepfather, who was an alcoholic from the standpoint of his behavior, would have got involved. Because at least they keep people from drinking. But the first thing they do in an AA meeting, I went a few times with some of my people I was mentoring, everyone stands up and they say, I'm John, I'm an alcoholic. I'm sorry, but believing you're an alcoholic is not helpful. First of all, it's not true. But you'll always create the environment around you that you believe you have within you. If you think you're an alcoholic, I guarantee you, it's going to take 12 steps and 40 people to keep you from doing your B. So when we're dealing with our students, we have to deal with them from the standpoint of what God says about them. And so sometimes you got to get a break from a student who's continually doing stupid stuff. You have to remind yourself or put somebody in there that believes in them. I can tell you to this very day, I even have staff members that I struggle with. We have a staff of almost 700, 300 interns leading. So, it's not everybody enjoys everybody. And what I've learned to do most of the time, I'm pretty good at this. I would say I'm a B. I get a B for this. When I have a continual problem with a staff member, and I start to feel like I am actually talking to them through their poor whatever, I give them to someone else. I'm like, Dan, I think you should deal with them. I think I'm pulling them back into their stuff. And so all of that to say, if you think you're leading sinners, you'll treat them like people who need to be controlled. And you can have the most powerful teaching, but if your idea of your people is we leave them alone, they'll screw up. You will screw up your culture. I could tell you, I've been to lots and lots of schools, and in the earlier days, I used to speak at a lot of our schools. Obviously hard to do that now. But they're teaching the right stuff, but the culture is totally twisted. And over the years, the early years, I would take a lot of the leaders of those schools that are planting schools, and I would say, what do you think about your students? Who are your students? Well, they're just young, and I'm like, I understand all that. I'm asking you to tell me who they are after the Spirit. And so I think one of the things that creates Bethel culture is this culture of honor, and I think honor actually begins with identity. I think honor begins with identity, and I think that if you believe that your students are amazing, it's amazing how much difference that makes in the way that you interact with them. So for instance, if we have a student who's doing something dumb, I think continually, especially repeated offenses, I think are people who've lost their sense of who they are. So I can talk to them about what they did that's dumb, and I probably do have to talk about that. But what I'm really going to talk to them about is two things. One, who are you? And two, why did you come to this school? And I'm calling them back to a vision, because without a vision, people perish or they go unrestrained. So I think two things. They've lost their identity and they've lost their sense of purpose. And I think we can talk to them about whatever it is that they're doing that's wrong, and I think we should. But I think that most importantly is that we remind them of who they are and then help them get back to the place of their purpose and vision. That's a good word. Just thinking through if I wanted to say something else about that. So we want to create a culture of world changers. Now, one of the things that I think that is important is that to the level that you empower people, you must confront them. So I could tell you that you're going to hear from the team. Lots of things you're going to hear from the team are the practical outgrowth of some of the things I'm sharing with you. Like if you're going to empower people to a 10, 1 to 10, 10 being the highest, you better confront them to a 10. If you empower people to a 10 and you confront them to a 5, let's say you empower them to a 10 and you confront them to a 6, that gap of 4 right there, that's going to be your problem. And so I'd propose that you develop a culture of confrontation, because I don't think it's just the leaders who need to confront. I think the culture needs to confront. And I think that that we teach people how to confront nobly. It's interesting to me, the story of King David. I'm actually writing a historic fiction novel. It probably take me the next 25 years. I'm working on it for 3 years and have 4 chapters. But I'm learning a lot. And, David was vigilant against enemies. He's famous for killing Goliath and, all the crazy stuff he did. But the Bible gives this commentary of David. He never confronted his sons. You know why he didn't confront his sons? John Paul Jackson told me this when he was alive. I was telling John Paul about this revelation I got, that we need to confront people to the level that we could empower them. And I told him this story about David. It was interesting because the Lord had already been speaking to him about that. He said, do you know why David didn't confront his sons? I said, no. He said, because his spiritual father, Saul, abused David with his authority. So David, instead of responding, reacted and did the opposite and never confronted his sons. And thus, David had 3 sons who usurped his throne. The most famous is Absalom, but also Adoniah, and I'm sorry, I forgot the name of his 3rd son. But that all usurped his throne. You know why? Because David never confronted his sons. His commander-in-chief, Joab, you'll remember Joab. Joab killed the Israeli leader who brought the other 11 tribes to David. And Joab puts his arms around him and kills him in peacetime. And it says David was angry and rebuked Joab, but he remained his commander. And Joab remained not loyal to David his entire life. And when Adoniah pronounced himself king, Joab was with him. That's the nature of Joab. And what I'm getting at is this: if you empower your students, but you don't confront them, then you will actually create a culture of Absaloms. It won't be their problem, it'll be yours. So now, when I talk about confronting, and again, the team's going to give you much better information on this. I'm not talking about yelling, screaming, or anything that some of us grew up with. In fact, I'm talking about keeping nobility, honor, and identity at the center of our confrontations, which Bill calls giving people the benefit of the doubt. But the benefit of the doubt doesn't mean I'm going to pray for them. The benefit of the doubt means I'm going to talk to them. Matthew 6 and Matthew 18 make it clear if you have something going on with your brother, you're to go talk to them. Not talk to 15 people, talk to them. And so we create a culture where we say things like this. Like this is one of our standard confrontations. When you did such and such, which you think was not positive, what were you thinking? No, it's not what were you thinking, it's what were you thinking? Because I've found that oftentimes people do the wrong thing with the right heart. It's amazing what happens when you go, what were you thinking when you did that? And they go, I was da-da-da-da. Oh. Sometimes even when I view it through their lens, I'm like, oh, well, that wasn't a big deal. Oh, but lots of times I go, oh, you were trying to accomplish that. Okay, here's the way the Lord would have you do that. And so I'm like, you didn't do anything wrong. You just, you had a good heart. You just didn't quite do it the way it could be done. So in other words, I'm confronting thinking the best of you. I'm thinking, you probably didn't know this was destructive. Does that make sense? And then I'm talking through it with you. And if you really did do something wrong that really didn't have a good motive, I'm putting some accountability with you, because that you may have a rut in your brain in which this is your continuing behavior. It needs someone to take you by the hand and walk you out of it. Does that make sense? So when we're training people, this is another good thing. Like, it's not practice that makes perfect. It's perfect practice that makes perfect. It's not helpful when people prophesy. We have people prophesy and they do something wrong in their prophecy and we don't talk to them about it. So we call it creating a culture of coaches and refs. So we say, listen, in fact, I like to describe this whenever we're going to do an activation the first time. I say, okay, let me just tell you, like, how many of you ever played basketball or soccer? Most are going to raise their hand. I'm saying, okay, so you can go down to the park and play soccer or basketball with your friends. We call it pickup games. That's one thing. But if you're going to play on a team, you have a coach and you have referees. This is not a free-for-all. You've come here to learn things that you didn't know, which means you've entrusted us to teach you the things you don't know. So when you do something, you're going to have coaches who go, hey, wait, let's shoot that differently. Oh, I made the basket. Yeah, there's lots of ways to make a basket, but if you want to be consistent, then there's some form you need. The same thing with referees, like, whoa, that's out of bounds. So we have a culture, for instance, that we say we're looking for treasure, like prophecy is always encouraging, exhorting, and comforting. Now, if you have some other idea about that, and I can understand where you get that from the scriptures, I really want to challenge you, like, at least establish your culture on encouraging, exhorting, comforting. If you want your students to be able to correct and direct people, which I don't allow my students to do, then I would wait till you make sure. I would teach them encouraging, exhorting, comforting, and then I would let a few students who you think are typically positive, encouraging people, let them correct people. In other words, I don't want correction to be our culture. I see some correction in the New Testament. I'm not dumb. I run a school of the prophets every year. Been doing this a long time. And inevitably people are like, oh, you're not letting us correct people. It's like, no, I'm not letting you correct people. Right. Because I have 2,000 of you in our city. And when you correct people, I have to take responsibility for it. And frankly, I don't want to empower you to that level. So, we have a culture where our students aren't allowed to correct people. They're not allowed to give negative words. And by the way, I could tell you that we maybe get 8 to 10 complaints a year. And, there's 600 people on our prophetic teams and 2,400 people in our school. I think that's pretty good. So, if you want to create a different culture, that's fine. Just make sure you know that Kris doesn't want you to. So I think that you should explain the culture to your students that very early on, that this is a culture of coaches and refs. So when we go, whoa, let's try that prophecy again. Let me give you some instruction on that. That they don't feel like, because, I find that most of our students, we get the most supernatural students. Like the students we get, they were the famous champions in their church. They're not famous champions in our church. We have thousands of you. So in their church, oftentimes they stand up and give a word and the pastor's just like, well, they're the most, they must be right. I'm like, no, we don't assume we don't make assumptions like that. You're here to learn. I'm listening to your word. I'm listening to your motive. I'm trying to figure out what lens you're sharing through. Like if you have the same kind of words all the time, I'm like, maybe you got a broken lens. Maybe you're not seeing the world clearly. And I tell my students, if I listen to you for half an hour prophesy, I learn more about you than I learn about the person you're prophesying to. Because we tend to see people not as they are, but as we are. So I'm saying that the goal is to grow them. They have to know, and when the coach stops the play and goes, hey, let's rerun that play, nobody walks off the court and goes, I'm just taking my ball and going home. You're on a team here. This is a real team. This is what we're doing. So they have to know, like, you're trying to help them. Like, you're here to coach them. when you go, hey, that's out of bounds, let's not do that. Like sometimes people are like, I see a storm over your life. And, I remember one student prophesied to a pastor in our environment, I see God, you're like Job, and you're going to lose everything. But God's going to restore twice as much. I'm like, that's not a positive word. Try it on yourself first, And she thought she'd given a positive word because she said, you're going to get double back. I'm like, if I'm rich, I don't need double back. I'm just good with what I have. So please don't be afraid of your students, no matter how powerful they are. Listen, I've seen the most gifted people. I'm probably not the most gifted people on the planet, but I have pastored a lot of really gifted people. I mean, way more gifted than I am, who have terrible character. So your gift does not impress me. And Bill says, if you have character and you don't have power, I'm not impressed. And I would say the same, and I'd also say, if you have power and you don't have character, I'm not impressed. The goal is to send out noble people. The goal is to mold our powerful people into noble people carrying the mind of Christ, the attributes of God, the holiness of God into a dark world. That's the goal. Okay, the last part, so part one, who are you? I'll do 3 months of that. Who are you and whose are you? Who is God and who are you? Those two are the same to me because when you see him, you become like him. So we're talking about the nature of who he is, and then we're connecting it like you were made in his image. So we're always tying it back to, if that's who God is, then how does that affect you? How does that affect your identity? The next part is, how do royal people behave? And then the last part that I do intentionally is then what if that's who you are and that's how you behave, then what's your responsibility and authority? So I always say you can always tell how close you live to the palace by how you behave, by how you respond to injustice. When Moses was living in Pharaoh's palace and he saw his brothers mistreated, he felt like he should do something. That's the normal response of royal people. When I actually know who I am, whose I am, and understand I was born for nobility, then I see injustice, I automatically feel like I'm supposed to do something about this. Why? Because I'm a child of a king. I'm not a child of a president, I'm a child of a king. I'm raised in the royal palace. And one of my jobs isn't just to sip suds with the king. One of my jobs is to help undo injustice, whether it's spiritual injustice through demons and sickness and disease, or whether it's social injustice. Like, our people should feel charged when they see injustice around them. And by the way, oftentimes, what they're supposed to do is determined by the way they see the world. I say, whoever God is to you, he'll be through you. So when our students are like, I just see, I see like women being mistreated and and I just wonder, when someone's going to do something about that. Well, I don't stay up at night thinking about that. But if you do, you can tell where you're called. That's what you're seeing from the windows of the castle, and that's what you're supposed to be doing. So it's the most repeated verse in Esther. What if you were born for a time like this? And so it's not just about hanging out and being beautiful in the castle, and entertaining the king. It's about, what was I born to do? And so I spend a lot of time in the last part of the school year talking about this is your responsibility and this is your authority. Jesus didn't say pray for the sick. He said heal the sick. And I've heard people say, I can't heal the sick, only Jesus can. Well, actually, Jesus said heal the sick. So you must be able to, either that or he gave you a commandment that you can't do. You do carry authority that you don't know you carry. It's really important that our students understand that their relationship with the Father gives them untold authority. Crazy authority. So the idea, Jesus does everything. He can do everything. He's all powerful, but he's told me to do it. People ask questions. You know, one of the most repeated questions asked by people who don't know God and don't want to know God is, if there's a loving God, then why is there da, 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 da? I don't know. Why is there? The heavens, the highest heavens belong to the Lord, but the earth has been given to the sons of men. So the question is, why do you let that happen? Because how many know God's in charge, but he's not in control? He's put you in control. He said, make disciples of nations. I know this point's probably not going to be as popular, but I think it's become a bigger or a larger part of our culture. I think you should examine your eschatology. If you're teaching, you know, the tribulation and all of that stuff, and that's a big part of your teaching, by the way, I'm not attacking you. I'm telling you what's making our school. You've come here to learn, why are we successful? One of the reasons we're successful is because we give people hope. One of our gals said, he who gives the most hope has the most influence. Jesus said, make disciples of nations, of all nations. He actually said, make disciples of all nations. In fact, Acts 2:17, you know the verse well. It's a quote from Joel. In the last days, I'm going to pour my spirit out on all flesh. In the book of Hebrews, the Hebrew writer says, in the last days, you will not say, know the Lord, for they shall all know the Lord, from the least to the greatest. Isaiah chapter 2 says, in the last days, that the mountain of the house of the Lord will become chief of the mountains. People will stream to it. And it goes on talking about the mountain of the house of the Lord will become chief of all the mountains. It's speaking of authorities. It goes on to talk about what will happen. It says, and the Lord will judge between many nations. And the outcome of that is that they will beat their spears into pruning hooks and their swords into plowshares. And the last part of that verse says, and never again will they train for war. Isaiah chapter 9 verse 6 says, and there shall be no end to the increase of his government or of peace. For the zeal of the Lord of hosts will accomplish this. And we're like, oh, that's in the millennium. It's funny, none of those verses that I quoted said anything about millennium. So I'm concerned that we push the promises of God into a time zone that we have no responsibility for and we can't receive. And I'd propose to you, it was the promises of Abraham that actually became our inheritance. And one of the promises to Abraham was that you shall be a father to many nations. Abraham wasn't the father of Israel. Jacob was the father of Israel. Abraham was the father of many nations, including Israel. And by the way, chapter 4 says, and so shall his descendants be, the father of nations. These are things we should think through. If you want a different eschatology, just realize that what you believe about the end is going to determine how people behave in the middle. If you're still singing this little light of mine, you've got the wrong eschatology and theology. You don't have a little light. Malachi 4 says, the sun, S-U-N, of righteousness shall rise upon you, healing in his wings. The sun. You don't have a little light. You have the sun. I'm saying that song came from a wrong core value about who you are and whose you are. And I'd like to just challenge you on a theology I've heard over and over repeated that says, you know, in the last days, the darkness is going to get darker and the light's going to get brighter. Or they say it like the world's going to get darker and the church is going to get brighter. Well, I'm sorry, Jesus said you're the light of the world. So you're speaking against what Jesus said. The only way it can get brighter in the church and darker in the world, the only way light can get brighter in one place and darker in another is if you shield it, like you put a basket over it. But Jesus thought through that, and he said, no one lights a light and puts it under a basket, but sets it on a lampstand. And then the next verse says, and you're a city set on a hill. So you're not the light of the church, you're the light of the world. So if something's getting darker and the light's in the world, it may be the church getting darker. But that's the only analogy that works. So I'm saying you can't teach the world's supposed to get darker and be congruent with what Jesus said. If you have a different eschatology, please, feel free to challenge yourself. People want to come up and tell me like I don't understand any other eschatology. You remember, I was raised in the Jesus movement, Most famous bumper sticker is, you can have this car in the rapture. I didn't go on to college because I was taught. I got saved when I was 18, and I was taught like Jesus is going to come back any minute and take us out of this terrible world. And the tribulation is going to happen, and you got to watch out for the beast. And we, late great planet Earth was the Bill's, How Heaven Invades Earth book. It was the foundation of everything we believed about eschatology. And I can tell you, so I believed that for 10 years. I taught it to other people. I understand the implications of it well. And everybody that thinks they know about the book of Revelation, I can tell you that people who thought they knew that, they keep changing the dates on their books. And Late Great Planet predicted the end of the world 3 different times, and every edition they changed the date. It's the true story. And by the way, I'm not against Hal Lindsey. He was teaching what he thought was right. Now, we've all done the same. But my point is that eschatology is very destructive to the church. It keeps, the Muslims are discipling 5 nations. How many are we discipling? 0. You have to think through what you believe about the end times. So and that leads to this last point. We should train and equip with deployment in mind. Train and equip with deployment in mind. What I mean by that is protocol matters. Protocol is honor in action. Protocol matters. Funny, one verse that sticks out in my mind, it's kind of a silly verse, but it says that when Joseph was called to see the king, he was in prison and he finally got the opportunity. It says he shaved and cleaned himself up. He wasn't a pig in the palace. Sometimes people, have to get past our stuff so they can get to God because we insist on behaving a certain way. So I want to tell you, if you're training people for your church, and a lot of you are, then the way they prophesy, the way they behave, all of that is probably going to be fine. But if your people, for instance, have to speak in tongues before they prophesy, that's the way I grew up. So we shamba before we give the word. It's going to be hard to do that in places I go. You're like, shut up, you do that in the mall, they're probably going to carry you out. They're going to think you're having some kind of a, epileptic seizure. And the drama, I love the drama. I listen, I know I'm being funny because I was raised in all of it. I was with the Jesus people, then I was with the charismatics, then I was with the Pentecostals, and then I was with the mixture of all of them. So as far as the waves of the Spirit that have inspired prophecy, I've been in all 4 waves. And none of it's been bad. Well, of course, some of it's been bad, but none of the culture's bad. It's just a culture. When you're in Russia, you behave a certain way. When you're in England, you behave a certain way. The United States has their own way. None of it's, in my opinion, mostly bad. It's just a culture. So, if your people, if they have to manifest, you know what I'm saying? Like, the Lord says, I've been in all of that. I know it all. I know all that. I understand what it's like to sound like Shakespeare. It's how we prophesied. When you prophesied, you shifted to Shakespeare. My first 15 years in the Lord, you read King James and you sounded like Shakespeare because that's how Jesus talked. And listen, it's funny. It all works fine in the church, in your church. But if you're thinking that you're going to deploy your students anywhere besides your church, you better be thinking about where you're deploying them to so that you train them in a way that's relevant to that culture. I've been, in the last 6 years, one of my primary ministries is to politicians. It's a completely different world. I'm having to learn core values, another level of confidentiality, even social networking. I don't put pictures of politicians on my webpage because they get associated to Bethel and all their craziness and all my craziness. And it's in honor, I have to learn there are certain things I don't do in that world. And so, I'm teaching, so I don't grab a student out of my prophetic teams and take them to DC with me. I'm like, they get more training before we go into that palace because you can't even do stuff that you can do at the Walmart at the palace. They have to dress up. They have to ladies have to be very modest in their dress. And all of that doesn't matter to me unless I'm taking you there. And, and I can't, we're not practicing on the politicians. Like, we're not like, you can't make mistakes there. They don't have some of the stuff I teach on prophecy is like they need to judge the prophecies. It's like, most of them aren't Christians. You're like, hey, that one might not have been right. Maybe just think about that one. That first one I gave you, that one went, whoa, I got the Holy Ghost on that one. Like, it's all funny for us, but not so funny to them. So I'm simply saying that you need to be thinking about where you're deploying them to. I propose that some of you are deploying people places you've never been. So I would do a little research, like what's okay there? What is protocol there? I remember when we first started reaching in the political world in a proactive way, that we brought this gal in who served President Bush for 4 years as his PA, and I had her speak to our team. I was like flabbergasted that I had spoken to several politicians without keeping any of that protocol. And so, things like you don't bring politicians gifts, like it seems like a bribe. You can't do that kind of stuff. Things you think are honoring are not okay there. So there's just, I'm actually not talking so much about protocol as I am about deployment. So where are your students going to be deployed? I was in one of our satellite schools, a school that was just using our stuff. Really good school. And I was teaching there. And before I was taught, the leader of the school was bringing some students up, and they were sharing some testimonies from their outreach they did the day before. And they said, yeah, we got kicked out of the mall. And they were sharing about how they went in the mall and they were, healing the sick and whatever they were doing. And the security, actually had to usher them out of the mall. Like, there was 20 of them. And the students started clapping. Well, my piss meter just... I'm like, what are we doing? Like offending the world, you don't have as much influence in people's lives as they have value for you. That's not a victory. Like, you went in and offended our city. Now, I don't mind offending people. I'm probably the one of the most offensive guy when it comes to abortion. I'm not going to pull punches. That's the worst Holocaust in the history of the modern world. And I'm going to tell it how it is. Now, I'm going to say it kindly to different people. I'm going to say it different ways, of course. But I'm not going to back off on that. If some politician doesn't want me in there because he knows I'm ultra pro-life, that's okay. I'm fine with that. If some president doesn't want me in his office because I'm pro-life, I'm fine with that. But I have proactively thought through that. But I am not running around trying to offend people on purpose. I used to do that. It's just stupid. And you narrow yourself down to a little pond called the charismatic, supernatural, very ultra conservative, nobody listens to you church. In your little pond, thinking you're changing the world. You're changing your 12 disciples. That's all you're doing. So I'm like, if you want to make a difference, then you need to just be thinking through the deployment. So, I teach our students, don't shamba before you prophesy. Well, I think I have to. Well, show me in the Bible where you have to. Because a lot of the stuff that we think's Bible is just tradition. It's not bad tradition. It's just tradition. Does that make sense? And there's nothing wrong with tradition unless your tradition keeps people from hearing the gospel because of your tradition. And so, anyway, I get you, I guess, at the end of the week. Is that true? I have another session? Good. So I'll tell you the truth the next session. Why don't you stand up so let me pray for you before you go. I hope I didn't offend somebody on accident. Yeah. Next session I think at the end, I want to talk about moving from denominationalism to apostleships and how that affects our schools. Because we have to be able to let people think, and that means we have to learn how to receive different opinions. And it may not be our opinion, we may not agree with it, but it doesn't affect our ability to love people and value them. So Lord, I thank you for what you're doing this morning. And I pray that out of this school, would come an amazing movement all over the world, that wonders and signs and miracles and the love of God would seep into the darkest places of the planet. And literally the sun of righteousness would rise in darkness. And those who in darkness would see a great light. In Jesus' name. Everybody said, I receive that for myself. Amen. Thank you so much. God bless you.